Hi there, welcome back. If you are watching this, you got the link for this extra special sort of part of the presentation. If you were watching live yesterday, you noticed that about 90 minutes, everything went completely blank and the internet went out, which was not a lot of fun. Kind of bummed, but at least I'm glad we got through the whole presentation. I did want to come back today and redo, or at least reshoot, answers to your questions because I thought they were really quite good. So we're gonna go through those a little bit today. If I remember correctly, we answered this one about being pushed down. I think we started answering this one about questions from Brett, but I'll go ahead and repeat it anyway. Brett asked, when is the right time in the sales process to ask if they're a decision maker? Well, first of all, we don't want to ask about decision maker and the concept of, are you the decision maker? You heard that in the presentation. But my personal belief is it's never too early to start asking about the decision process, right? I might not in my first conversation or even my second say, so do you make decisions, or in the vernacular we've been using, do you have the authority to make a decision to move forward with ... But it certainly would be reasonable to say something like, hey, so I'm curious, how do you guys go about making investment decisions here at ABC Company? When you're talking to folks like myself, how do you move from this conversation, polite chit chat, to actually moving forward with something? How does that work around here, right? Nice open-ended question, broad, etc. Now, it's certainly possible that somebody might come back and say, well, it's a little early for that. And my response would be something like, well, that may be so, but I certainly wouldn't want to get, weeks or even months into our conversations and start formulating these great ideas and have no clue whatsoever how you and I would together move this through the processes in your organization. What you're really trying to do is out the fact that it's more than likely they don't have a full understanding, or even perhaps any understanding, of how these things really do work in their organization. And that's fine, but we want to start that conversation early. We don't want to, because we're too nervous to ask or talk about it, like I said, be months in and then, oh, wow, gosh, I don't even know, or we have to talk 3 levels up and we've formulated all these ideas absent the real person of authority. See, a person of authority is going to want to make a decision to invest in something that aligns with their specific interests, their specific initiatives, the things that their compensation is tied to. And it kind of makes sense early on to get them involved, to make sure that either the stuff you're working on is already aligned, or get a sense of how you would align it to what they're looking for. So Nick had a question. When you have a strong contact who says, the decision maker will go with my recommendation, doesn't get involved, will sign off on my recommendation, they're lying. Yeah, I'm being a little glib here. They're not really lying. They're not being accurate, right? In reality, while that may be the case, it is rarely so. At the end of the day, like I said in the previous question, companies spend money to invest in solutions, anything, people, process, tools, technology that furthers their goals. It is not true that people spend money, companies spend money to make things easier. Somewhat, counterintuitively, concepts that to us seem very obvious, like better customer service, right? So you're selling a solution that in theory is going to provide better customer service. Well, there is no absolute mandate in any company for better customer service. However, if there's an individual, let's call him the VP of customer care, who has a specific metric KPI initiative that they are focused on this year to move a metric, let's say their net promoter score, then that might be something that they are willing to entertain outside services, products, technology to help them accomplish. In order to get money, in order for somebody to actually purchase your solution, somebody's going to have to actually believe that what you're providing is going to further that cause. They're not going to do it just because, well, who wouldn't want customer service? The answer is, that's one thing to say it. It's another thing to actually get investment around it. So you're really going to have to push back, at least politely at first, and say, well, let's talk about that a bit. Walk me through in the past some situations where this has happened, right? And ideally what you're looking for is something that is of similar, complexity or revenue value, et cetera, right? Somebody might say, oh, they always, go ahead and sign off my recommendations. Well, that's fine. We're talking about $100,000 purchase here. Have you brought $100,000, investment to your person of authority and had them sign off on that? Did you have to jump through any hoops? Did you have to present anything to them? Now, I can also back off of this a little bit and say, maybe they're going to go with your recommendation. But my guess is you're not going to walk in the office and say, hey, boss, I decided to spend $100,000 on, Townsend Consulting. You're probably going to go in and say, hey, I have a recommendation for something, and they're going to want to review it, talk about it, et cetera. So then we can actually take the time to say, well, let's talk about that. How have you brought specifically your recommendation to the POA in the past? What tools do you use? How do you present that? How do you set it up, et cetera? So maybe rather than going right at them in terms of, hey, that's bullshit, they don't take your recommendation, we just kind of take the word that they're saying, recommendation, and instead turn that in our head into, some other word that says, they allow me to present my ideas for their review and approval, and we let them call it a recommendation. Don't get too worried about it. Question from Prentice. How do you get around above someone without offending them? Should refusal to introduce me to the broader team or decision maker disqualify them? Really interesting. And there's another question here. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. One of the first things that you probably have to do is take a step back and say, what makes you think you're going to offend them, right? Is asking somebody about the decision process, understanding the relationship, and then saying, I'd like to speak with that person. Offensive, right? Now, when we kind of presuppose that there's going to be an offense, I would suggest that a lot of times we actually create that. One of the things I work really hard to do is to ask questions that are important in a very neutral way, right? I have to kind of step back and say, well, I may have a bias towards I've offended people in the past, or this is a question that would offend me. I need to clear that kind of head trash out from my own mind before I go and ask the question. If you take a step back and imagine you're this third-party observer here, somebody, watching two people talking, just saying, hey, so how does this work here? Well, I bring it to so-and-so. Great. Have you done that in the past? What have you? I'd like to meet with your boss, right? That's a very simple request. I didn't say I'd like to meet with your boss because, I don't trust you. I didn't say I'd like to meet with your boss because you're not going to get it done. I just said I'd like to meet with your boss. Now, they might come back and say, well, why? And you might want to have a good answer for that. So I would ask you, why would you want to meet with your boss, right? And if your answer in your mind, in your heart is, well, because I don't think you can get this job done, well, that might be a little, not necessarily offensive, but kind of demeaning to them. But instead, if you say, well, in my experience, I am best able to serve companies like ABC Company, I'm best able to serve a prospective client like you, when I can also talk to, for lack of a better term, the horse's mouth. To date, you shared with me, the or the requirements and the things that your boss has put upon you. The good news is I get to talk to dozens, maybe hundreds of people like you and like your boss every year. And oftentimes when I do, I discover that some of the requirements that have been passed down aren't fully complete, that they've missed some things. So one of the things I like to do is at least, shake the hand of the person who's going to be writing the check and let them know who we are and make sure that they have the same confidence in our services. Now, the other thing that I see a lot as a challenge is we present a request to talk to somebody higher as just that, as a request. Hey, do you think it'd be okay to? Would you mind if I, right? Versus something that just has to happen, right? One of the interesting things about interacting with other human beings is that the mindset you come into the conversation with often creates the reality. If I come in expecting to offend this person, expecting it to be difficult, well, gosh, lo and behold, what a shocker, there's resistance. If I come in and truly in my mind, I view speaking with everybody involved in this decision process as, just the way you do things, well, what happens in reality is the chances of actually getting resistance are a lot lower. And I'll give you a very simple example. For me, asking to go talk to the person of authority who's going to be writing the check and having a direct relationship with them in addition to my primary point of contact is no more important than having direct exposure to some of the end users, right? So, you might want to think about it this way. If you're only trying to position with, the decision maker, the person of authority, and you haven't said, well, can I talk to Bob who's going to use this software and Mary who's going to focus on getting us the data out of the system, it might come across as disingenuous that all you really care about is winning this deal, and somebody told me I need to win the deal by going to the top. But if in fact your sales approach is very holistic, it's I need to understand lots of things about this organization, I want a broad-based view of what is required so I can serve you, again, in my experience, there's very little resistance. Now, the next one here, the how do you deal with I'm gathering information on all vendors and presenting, etc. That can be a tricky one because you really have to understand where are they in their process, right? If they have done the due diligence of defining the problem they're trying to solve, creating a very a very complete set of requirements that they believe will give them the exact solution that they need, well, then it might make sense for them to send somebody out and talk to some vendors and say, hey, let's do some screening here. The challenge is oftentimes when I hear I'm gathering information, what's really happening is the scenario I talked about during the presentation. Somebody had an idea. We haven't really dissected or gone to understand the problem. We haven't defined any requirements for what a solution would look like. We're just talking to vendors, right? To see what's out there, to give us ideas. What's funny is looking at solutions never gives you a more complete view of your problem, right? Think about that for a second. Looking at other people's software doesn't have you say, well, gosh, now I understand what's going on with me. All it does is show you what somebody else is doing, right? The whole concept of, well, let's talk to vendors to see what we need is kind of absurd. So what do? Well, if somebody's gathering information, that doesn't necessarily mean you say, well, heck with you, go away. I just want you to understand you're not in the sales process. You're in an information gathering process with a very, I don't want to say low level, but not connected to the person of authority. You have no idea if there's even a project and an initiative, something going on. They're just information gathering. But of course, as I said earlier, they're not going to say, hey, we're just going on a wild goose chase to check out a lot of software and see what we like. They're going to tell you, oh, well, we're going to have a recommendation. There's a decision. But just you talking about, or them talking about, there's a decision process here, doesn't mean there's a decision. So another way to test this might be as follows. Hey, that sounds great. I understand that you guys are busy and it makes sense to centralize the gathering information. Tell me what happens once all that information is gathered. Well, we present it, for the recommendation. Oh, that's fantastic. Who do you present it to? Well, the committee. Oh, tell me more about this committee. When do they meet? Well, you don't need to worry about the committee. No, I don't need to worry about the committee. I don't need to meet them. I'd like to understand what happens down the road. Do you guys have a defined set of requirements you're working off of? Well, no. Okay. So this is really just an exploratory stage. Do you have any budget set aside for this? Have you put aside a pile of money that you are looking to spend and do this? Now, I know I said earlier, don't use the B word. Be careful how you use it. Often in this situation, I'll say, do you have a defined set of money behind this, or is something that you'll then go find the money for, right? There's your key that you're not in a sales process. You're in a information gathering process, which again is okay. Just don't confuse the two. Allison, how do you deal with decision influencers? In our world, they can be stealthy, who can make or break. They don't sign the checks. They don't make decision, but they influence. We have some tactics and strategies, blah, blah, blah. How do you identify and ultimately diffuse? Well, this is an interesting question. I think one of the real key elements here, Allison, is that you have to ask yourself, is the person of authority, which I assume you're talking to in this case, do they have a specific plan, schema, process to make a decision, right? Oftentimes when I kind of look at a deal that has come apart at the last minute because, oh, this surprise influencer came in, what I find is that the person of authority who was supposed to make the decision either really wasn't sure how they were going to make the decision, or more importantly, hadn't set up a decision process for themselves, right? So a simple way to handle this might be as follows. As you're talking to the person of authority, one of the conversations, assuming you're talking to that person, one of the conversations you have to have is, okay, so how are you going to make a decision? What are the problems that you're looking to solve? What are the criteria you've identified as a successful resolution of those problems? Who are the people in your organization you're going to turn to provide input for this? Here's where it gets interesting. It shouldn't be a surprise to you, at least at this point, that people come out of the woodwork at the last minute and say, well, I'm not sure I like that. right? Maybe they don't like the solution. Maybe they don't like you. Maybe they just don't like change, right? So why not have a conversation with your person of authority that says something like this? Well, assuming you got a good plan, that sounds great. Let me ask you something though. In an organization of your size, there's going to be people who probably aren't, thrilled about change. How do you deal with that? Where do you, Mr. and Mrs. Person of Authority, expect resistance to come from? Probably at the last minute, right? Because we all know those folks who are naysayers, who don't want change. They don't participate in the process. They don't give their input. They just come in at the end and throw rocks. So how do you deal with that? How do you move these things through? And more importantly, what are you going to do when that happens? How are you going to deal with it? How can I help, right? What I don't want to have happen, Mr. and Mrs. POA, is we do all this work, and then at the last minute, some folks who are really important in the process but didn't participate come in and, basically unhook all the good work we've done. So let's think about that. Let's come up with a plan for that. And then maybe let's set it up so that those folks at the end, if they haven't participated, don't have as much influence when they come out of the woodwork later and surprise us. Hope that makes sense. So some other miscellaneous scenarios that I wanted to just chat about real quickly. I talked briefly about the concept of boards. So a board of directors in a corporation is a very formal entity, right? The CEO reports to the board. The CEO, is hired by the board. Ultimately, the board works, at least in theory, for the shareholders. From time to time, you will come across selling situations where it will require board level approval, right? At certain dollar values, things go to the board. At that point, it's absolutely critical to understand what role does the board play, right? How does that happen, et cetera. In point of fact, even a board doesn't represent multiple POAs. There's always the chairman of the board or the most influential person on the board that makes things happen. But for the purposes of keeping it simple, we'll consider the board just a singular unit. I have a memory in my past of an opportunity that I worked for a long time, very big one. We were able to move our positioning from very low-level functional buyers up to the CIO. Unfortunately, our competitor came in and had a board-level relationship, and we lost the deal. So POAs actually are very important even at that corporate level, at the board level. You got to understand how that works. It really comes down to a simple question of, okay, when you say go to the board, how does that work? When does the board meet? How does this go in the agenda? If your contact or even the POA or who you thought was the POA up to this point says, well, I don't really know how that works, you're going to have to enroll them in figuring out how it works. Well, listen, we've been working a really long time on this. This is important. You told me it's going to help you do A, B, and C. Wouldn't it make sense for us to spend some time understanding how that board decision works? If you're going to bring it there, how that's going to work and how we can, make sure that that has a better outcome. Decision committees are one of my least favorite ways to sell. A lot of times they have to do and are very relevant in RFP situations, which I'll talk about in a second. Heck, I'll talk about them together. Generally speaking, I don't do RFPs. I don't understand companies that do RFPs. Now, in certain environments, public sector, some very, very large corporations, RFPs are how business is done. That doesn't make it okay. My wife was part of a very large public corporation, and they went out to RFP for a very, very complex, very, very expensive solution they needed in their world. Problem was, like most RFPs, they built the requirements themselves, didn't really have a lot of expertise in it. Turns out later, the people that won the deal had a very close relationship with the consultant who wrote the RFP. Shocking. And 2 years later, or 2 or 3 later, it doesn't really matter, the entire relationship fell apart, or at least was dramatically reduced, because none of the needs are really met. I don't know if this is really going to help you, but if you're in an environment where you're 100% dependent on RFPs, I might consider a different line of work. In 2018, the concept of a blind RFP process where people with little to no expertise in how things actually work are coming up with requirements and saying, we won't talk to you and we won't engage with you, that's pretty dysfunctional. I myself couldn't wake up every day chucking RFPs over the wall, hoping I'm serving somebody's needs. I just couldn't do it that way. So maybe can't help you with that. But problem is with RFPs, at a minimum, understanding how the RFP was created, understanding how the criteria will be weighted right, is critical. A lot of people submit the RFP with all the answers, but they don't really know the formula based on which that's going to be used, right? If you've got an RFP or some other blind response mechanism and the decision committee is going to make a decision based on the answers and their subjective opinion of those answers, well, if you have the slickest user interface, if you have the best software out there, it may make sense for you to, put your name in the hat. If you are anything but that, going through that process without understanding exactly how they're going to rate usability, how are they going to rate price, how are they going to use this other thing in the matrix, doesn't make a lot of sense. Procurement, one of my favorites. First statement, procurement is never a person of authority. They can position themselves as a person of authority, but only to say no. Procurement can block you and say no, but they can always be overridden by the true person of authority. Do you really think the CEO of a major corporation or any company is going to defer to their procurement organization? No. I've seen it time and time again. When the CEO wants something, if the board wants something, procurement will fall in line. So what does that really mean? If you're selling into procurement, sorry, you're selling to the wrong place in the organization. You're swimming upstream. It's no fun. They're going to try to convince you that they make the decision, you have to work through them, et cetera. But I can tell you from, like I said, a couple decades of doing this, that's simply not the case. I've said before, multiple persons of authority do not exist. There is always one person, one individual who can override everybody else. There's always, even when people say, oh, we make the decision equally, two partners in a business. I've literally sat in a room with a couple partners in a small business. Well, we're 50-50 partners. Okay, I hear you, but for what we're talking about, in my case, hiring me, which one of you could say, I want to do this, and the other one would say, okay, fine, right? Or which one of you could say, we're not doing this, this is stupid, and the other would say, okay, fine, you'll have your way. Because that always exists. Between any two human beings, there's some level of inequality. That's just how it is. Last little one here, what happens when the POA goes dark? And that was a really response to a number of questions. I think the first thing you have to ask yourself is, why did they go dark? Right? Did you fail to engage them at the beginning? Did you not set expectations about how they'd be involved later? Ultimately, if a POA goes dark, that's a pretty strong sign that this deal may be dead. One of the things I have on my website, and I think on my LinkedIn channel, is Guide to Ending No-Shows. But really what it is a whole process document around how do you deal with people disappearing. I take a very process-driven approach. If we have a scheduled conversation, and I'll get back to the POA in a minute. If we have a scheduled conversation on the calendar and you miss it, my first email is going to be, hey, sorry you missed our meeting. Here are suggested times for a reschedule. My second email, sent exactly 3 days later, is going to say, did you get my last email? I haven't heard from you. My next email is going to say, hey, I've sent you a couple emails. Seems like you've moved on to other priorities, right? Think about it. Why do we keep calling back, checking in, following up when the answer is obvious? If somebody's ignored 3 of your emails with not a vague, hey, want to get together, blah, 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 but a very actionable, let's talk then, haven't you got my other emails, and what I call a close the file email, seems like, you've gone another direction, you have your answer. What I found is sending this combination of emails will either get them back into the, into the conversation, hey, sorry, it's been busy here, no, we really want to do something, or they'll come back and say, yeah, you're right, we've moved on, or you'll get no response, in which case you have your response. So that is all for this special little supplement. Thanks so much for joining if you watched us the other day. And sorry about the technical glitch, but hopefully this makes up for it. Happy selling, and please let me know if I can ever be of any assistance and support your success.